Good morning. So hope everyone had a good Thanksgiving. I was texting with Janet, I think yesterday, and so we're kind of texting back and forth how our Thanksgiving was, and she asked me what I ate. So I said I had beef and pork, and she replied back, and the response was kind of interesting. She said, "Good combination." I'm like, good combination. And then I read what I texted, and instead of me typing beef, I typed beer and pork. And she said it was a good combination. So we know what Janet likes, beer and pork. But I had beef and pork over the Thanksgiving. It was the first time in a long time for us not having turkey because my mom was away. When your mom goes away, there's no turkey in the house. Okay, so be thankful for your mother, students. Okay, Pastor Joe is away, and he's in Kentucky, and so he'll be back soon. Let's continue to pray for him and his family for safe travel. So today, without further ado, let's go right into it. Today, the message is going to be neighbor. And it's going to come from Luke chapter 10, 25 to 35. So let's read this together. Andrew, if you can kind of go through the slide with me, please. It says 25. It says, "Behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to test, saying, 'Teacher, what shall I do to inherit the eternal life?' He said to him, 'What is written in the law? How do you read it?' Then he answered, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself.' And he said to him, 'You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live.' But then, desiring to justify himself, he said to Jesus, 'And who is my neighbor?' Jesus replied, 'A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, and stripped him, and beat him, and departed, leaving him to half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him, bound up his wounds, poured oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, 'Take care of him, and whatever more you've spent, I will repay you when I come back.' Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among robbers?" He said, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "You go and do likewise." This is the word of the Lord. This is a very popular parable. I was kind of reading a couple articles here, and I don't really read a lot of the articles in Philly, like Philly.com and the Inquirer. I have no idea why, but I don't. But I came upon this article, and about this particular article. That's Kate to your left, and to your right, it's Johnny. And basically, Kate lives in New Jersey. This happened like about a month ago. And she drove into Philadelphia to meet a friend. And as she came through, she didn't gauge her gas very well, and she ran out of gas. And the car started to flutter. And then she managed to maneuver her car out from I-95 into a shoulder to this one particular exit. And then she stopped and she called. And she was frantic. Right? And then all of a sudden, in the middle of this happened 11 p.m., mind you. And then all of a sudden, out of the dark, this person comes out. And she was startled. She was scared. And she told, and this homeless man, Johnny, told Kate to get back in your car, lock the door. I'll come back with gas. And then 10 minutes later, this guy comes back with a tank of gas. And come to find out, Johnny spent his last 20 bucks on the gas for this unknown stranger and gave it to him. And she was able to go and fill the gas up. The title was Homeless Man Who Gave Last $20 to Stranded Woman. Today's verse is very similar to what happened to Kate and Johnny. It tells about a stranger helping out when there was a need. It's a parable told by Jesus when a lawyer asked a question about how to inherit the eternal life. And Jesus' response to that was, what was written in the law? And this lawyer, who was very smart and understood the law, answered correctly. You have to love your God with all your heart, your soul, strength, and mind. And then love your neighbor. And then he wanted to kind of do a aha, gotcha moment, and he further pressed Jesus and asked, who then is my neighbor? From this question, Jesus tells of this parable of the Good Samaritan. And we know that story very well. And this man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and this person was attacked by the robbers. He was beaten, and he was stripped, and he was left on the road to die. Just like Kate, this Samaritan finds himself stranded. And not only that, Kate was stranded in a very sketchy neighborhood. This particular path from Jerusalem to Jericho was called the Way of Blood because this path was very dangerous. There were a lot of robbers that hid behind rocks and crevices and would attack. And looks something like that. That is a part of the pathway from Jerusalem to Jericho. Now, Jerusalem, we all know, is up on a hill. And to go down to Jericho, it is a downhill travel. And you see that any robbers can easily hide in those crevices and attack. And this is what happened. And then Jesus further explains that a priest from Jerusalem, after giving service, walked down and saw this injured man. Rather than helping, he went to the other side of the road and passed him. Likewise, a Levite, as you know, a Levite is a person that dedicates their life in service to the temple and assists the priest. He too saw the man, but with not helping, decided to go on the other side of the road and passed him as well. And then Jesus goes on to say a Samaritan walked by and noticed the injured man and said that, and he stopped. And he said he had compassion on this person that was lying on the road. And he tended to his injuries. And he loaded him to his animal. And then took him to the inn. And then further treated him. Not only that, he spent the night with this stranger. And then offered his own money to pay for and extended more money for extra costs. You know, the noteworthy, one of the noteworthy things that we need to realize is that a Samaritan is the last person that you would think would help this person, because a Samaritan was hated by Jews so emphatically, so immensely, because they consider Samaritans as half-breeds. But you see here, Jesus systematically and intentionally uses a Samaritan to describe what a good neighbor is. Like Johnny here, He's a homeless person. And you wouldn't think that a homeless person will be able to help this person that was stranded and needing help. He was the person, rather, that need help. So what drove Johnny, what drove the Good Samaritan to help, to be a good neighbor, to spend their own money? And what propelled them to act in kindness? And what did they realize about the definition of a neighbor that a lot of us perhaps are missing? In verse 29, it says this: "But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, 'And who is my neighbor?'" You know, many commentaries suggest that this lawyer had no intention of knowing who his neighbors were, but rather he wanted to know who his neighbors were not. Basically, he was limiting and no one to know who his neighbor and who they were not, so that he can choose to love, so that he can choose to serve, so that he can pick and choose the person or the people that he wanted to serve. You know, when we limit our neighbor, it's easy to love, isn't it? It's easy to sacrifice. It's easy to give of myself. It's easy to sacrifice and give that inconvenience. They're worthy of our inconvenience. Limiting who our neighbors allow us to do the bare minimum. To give just a little bit, limiting our resources, limiting our time, limiting our inconvenience just a little bit, so that it doesn't hinder my plan and my schedule. You know, I can think of many things that Johnny can do with that $20. That was all he had. But rather than spending on himself, he decided to spend and give a lending hand to a stranger. Talk about inconvenience. Spending your last $20 on someone that you don't know, knowing that you will go hungry, knowing that that was your life source for that day and the days to come, that is inconvenience. And I wholly believe that Johnny kind of knew the true meaning of neighbor. A neighbor that is in need of your help. It doesn't matter what that person is or not. A neighbor that is not limited by race, sex, creed, occupation, rich or poor, or a stranger. It is not limited. I'm reminded, 2016, on January last year, it was on Sunday, and we were worshiping like this. It was very cold that day. It was misting, and we were worshiping, and one of the KM ushers came into our worship and grabbed me and took me out and said that there's a person here that you need to speak to. So I said, okay, fine. So I proceeded to walk to this lady. Her name was Cindy. And she had a frightening look on her face. And she went to describe that her family, her husband and her son, was in the parking lot in the car. And it took her about an hour to decide whether for her to come into our church. And I said, why? And she said, you see, we're homeless right now. Her husband lost his job, and now they are left on the street, and they were living in their car. And they were driving around in Conshohocken, and they saw our sign that said Antioch Church. And they decided to pull in. But when they came into our parking lot, they sat for 1 hour deciding whether these people inside this church is going to help them. I know a lot of the leaders who are sitting here remember this. And then my heart went out to them. Never knowing the fact that the worship was continuing to happen at that time. So I said, bring your family in, because it was cold out there. So we took him in, we put him in the second floor EM office, and so we said, wait until our worship ends, and then we'll talk about it and we'll decide what to do. And then when the service ended, we brought Pastor Joe, and everyone else and all the leaders got involved. And so we decided to be a good neighbor. We didn't know whether these people were playing us. We didn't know whether these people were really homeless or not. That wasn't the issue. What we saw was that this people needed our help. So we put them into a hotel for 1 week. We paid for the hotel. And then every day, your leaders took turns providing food for this family. And things didn't go their way. So for a week and a half, they decided to go back to their home in North Carolina. But to get home, they needed a bus pass. And they didn't have any money. So we decided to pay for their bus ticket, and we sent them home. And the last text message I received from them was saying, thank you. Thank you to you and to your church members. And that's the last thing I heard from them. I don't know what happened to them. I don't know whether they were able to find a job there. I have no idea. But one thing I do know is that your leaders in this church stepped up and provided and became a neighbor for those people, a stranger, when they were in need. You know, Jesus is teaching us here a simple thing. To be a good neighbor, to be a neighbor is simple. See the need of that person. See the need of that person that's in front of us in the midst of our lives. We can't help everyone. We can't. But what we can do is help and be a lending hand to the people in our midst. And that's what the Good Samaritans did. That's what Johnny did. They helped. And as we go forward, in verse 39, it says, but a Samaritan, as he journeyed, he came to where he was. And when he saw him, he had compassion. I want to focus on that word compassion. We all know the definition of a compassion. It's a capacity to feel sorry for another suffering, pain, or misfortune. We know for sure that the priests and the Levites did not have compassion. Where can we find the model citizen that emulate and that exhibit the compassion? Is in Jesus Christ. If you look at the verses, if you look at the New Testament, you see again and again Jesus having compassion for those who were sick, those who were downcasted, those who needed help. We see him saying he had compassion. His heart was moved with compassion. A theologian, Frederick Buechner, I like his definition. His definition says, a compassion is sometimes a fatal capacity for feeling what is to live inside somebody else's skin. It is a knowledge that there can never be any peace and joy for me until there is peace and joy finally for you too. I like that one part. It says to live inside somebody else's skin. Not just be in their shoes, but in their skin. That is intimate. And this is what Christ showed us, what it means to be compassionate. In Mark 1, 40 and 41 says this. Now a leper came to him, imploring him, kneeling down to him, and saying to him, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Then Jesus, moved with compassion, stretched out his hand and touched him, and said to him, "I am willing, be cleansed." You know what the powerful part of this message is, this verse is? It's not the healing part of it. Jesus could easily heal him with the word, the power of his word. And we see time and again that Jesus healed when he wanted to, just by using his words. But he didn't do that this time. Instead, he showed compassion by touching this leper skin to heal. Can you imagine what this leper felt when he felt the skin of another person for the first time in his life? God knows how many years have passed since he had connection, had contact with another person's skin. It's not just about healing. A compassion moves our heart to the heart of those that are in need. Can you imagine what he felt? Christ understands what it means to be compassionate. He touched because he needed a touch. Not just a healing, but a healing touch. We all felt this. We all felt when we needed a touch from somebody when we are going through hell. We know the power of that touch, the compassionate touch. They don't have to say anything, just a touch. And this is what Christ provided for this leper. And this is what the Samaritan did. When the Levites and when the priests walked away. And this person was probably dirtied and was bloodied, was a mess. But the Samaritan got down and touched him. And he healed him. Jesus also showed compassion by crying, by weeping. John 11:35 is probably one of the shortest verses in the Bible. And simply it says this: Jesus wept. This is in the backdrop of Lazarus, one of his best friends, closest friends, have just died. And he's coming to them. And as Mary got down on her knees at the foot of Christ, she started weeping, saying, "Only if you were here, my brother would live." And everybody surrounding them started to cry. And you know what Christ said? It said in the Bible, says that Christ had compassion on them. And it says, Jesus wept. The interesting part of this verse is this. Christ knew that he was going to raise Lazarus. He knew that he's going to raise him again pretty soon. But he wept with him. Jesus understood what it means to be compassionate. He understood the frailty of human life. He understood the pain that caused when somebody dies. So he wept with them. Now this death is very personal to me because last Friday, my secretary from work, her husband passed away. He was only 63. He had lung cancer. He went in to get the cancer removed, and then because his body was so weak, he had multiple complications. He had bilateral pneumonia, along with sepsis, and then he had multiple complications. And then at the end, his body just started giving up, and his whole entire body organs, inside his organs, started to bleed out. I remember going to the hospital. I remember holding my secretary, what can you say to somebody when they're about to lose their loved one? You can't say anything. There's no words for me to say, hey, everything's going to be okay. It's not going to be okay. What do you say? The only thing that I could do is touch. I just have to embrace. I remember embracing her and crying with her. I remember when she came into our office and I embraced her in the middle of our aisle, in the middle of our office. And I remember embracing her. And I started praying for her. And as I prayed, she started to weep. And she started to cry. And she started to I could feel the tension kind of coming down. She's not a believer. But I said, Christ loves you. Christ understands what you're going through. Christ will weep. He wept when Lazarus died. When was the last time we actually cried for somebody? Up until this particular incident with my secretary, I can't remember the last time I cried. I see my mom crying watching Korean drama, but the last time I cried, I don't remember. Sometimes we cry for the wrong reasons sometimes. When was the last time we cried for somebody's pain? And we know that end of it all, Jesus showed compassion on the cross by dying. He had compassion. That cross right there, it's a symbol. It's not just an ornament that we see and we wear. It's a symbol of compassion. It's a symbol of grace. It's a symbol that reminds us, because of his compassion, because of what he did, we stand here. That is the gospel message. And my prayer is that you will experience the compassion, the message of compassion of Christ today. And that you be moved to seek after him. You remember the Kate and Johnny, the story that I just told you in the beginning? There's an interesting twist to this story. Kate was so moved by what Johnny did, she wanted to do more. So she decided to do something for him. And then so she set up a GoFundMe for Johnny. And her expectation was $10,000 to get him started, to get an apartment, get him a car, to find a job for him so that he can be a productive citizen in our society. And just past Wednesday, the GoFundMe account, the amount, as of now, is at $100,000. Compassion moves people. Compassion moves people. I'm sure Johnny didn't even remotely think, that if I help this person, maybe I'll get something back. That wasn't the case. He helped out of his compassion. And what a great story. What a great ending. I don't know how the Good Samaritan story ended, but just the fact that Christ told us a parable of this story speaks volume. It's for us too. It's our story as well. So I ask and I implore you that as we go out of this hall and out into into your respective lives, as we go into our campuses, our workplace, our family, let us be reminded, let us ask God to redefine who our neighbor is. To allow compassion to dictate and drive our caring heart. To seek those who are around us. To embrace, to share the compassion. And as we look at the cross, that we will truly be able to emulate what that cross represents. A compassion that was shed on that cross. Amen. Let's pray together.